Beneath a bruised gray sky and slashing rain, Captain Nathan Brooks knelt on soaked asphalt, hands trembling as he stroked Max before vanishing into a shadowy, perilous mission. Max's desperate howl pierced the storm as Nathan disappeared through the airport doors, leaving behind a fragile promise. That night, the German Shepherd bolted into the dark, defying thunder, racing to a fateful spot. But what drove him to stay at Terminal C for 6 relentless years? Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Thank you. The sky hung low and heavy, a bruised gray shroud pressing down on the airport parking lot. Rain slashed sideways, driven by a wind that howled like a wounded animal, tearing at the world below. In the fading light of that late afternoon, Captain Nathan Brooks knelt on the wet asphalt, his knees soaking through his uniform pants. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something clawing at his chest as he looked into Max's eyes. Those brown eyes, wide and trusting, shimmered with a loyalty that words could never capture. The German Shepherd's tail thumped against the pavement, a faint rhythm against the chaos of honking cars and roaring jet engines. Nathan's fingers dug into the thick fur behind Max's ears, finding that spot that always made the dog's tongue loll out in quiet bliss. "You be good, Sergeant," Nathan whispered, his voice rough, barely audible over the storm brewing around them. Sergeant, the nickname from their training days, when Max would sit at attention, ears perked, waiting for Nathan's every command. A soldier's dog through and through. Nathan forced a smile, but it faltered. His olive green duffel bag hung heavy on his shoulder, the straps biting into his skin as if anchoring him to this moment. He didn't want to go, not this time. Something about this deployment felt different, darker, sharper, like a blade glinting in the distance. But duty called, and Nathan Brooks never turned away from a call. Lucas Hayes stood a few feet away, arms crossed, tight over his chest, his dark hair plastered to his forehead by the rain. "You sure about this, man?" His voice carried a jagged edge of worry, slicing through the wind. Nathan didn't look up. He couldn't. If he met Lucas's eyes, he might see the same fear mirrored back, the kind that gnawed at a man's gut when he knew something was about to break. "He'll be fine with you," Nathan said, though the words tasted like ash. His hand lingered on Max's head, tracing the damp fur as if memorizing its texture. "I'll be back before he knows I'm gone." A lie. He felt it in his bones, but he said it anyway. For Max, for Lucas, for himself. Lucas shifted his weight, boots scuffing the wet ground. "Don't worry about anything here. I've got this." He patted his leg and Max glanced at him, a quick, polite acknowledgement, before turning back to Nathan, pressing closer, his warmth a desperate plea against the cold. "2 cups of food in the morning, 2 at night," Nathan continued, standing slowly, his knees popping. "Evening walk around 7. He likes the park best, chases squirrels like it's his mission." Lucas's hand landed on Nathan's shoulder, firm but gentle. "Nathan, I know. We've been over it. He'll be okay." His smile was thin, strained, but it held. Nathan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He gave Max one last pat, his fingers lingering on the dog's skull. "Be good, buddy," he murmured, then turned toward Terminal C. The glass doors loomed ahead, reflecting the storm's fury in distorted streaks of light. Max's whine cut through the air, a high, piercing sound that stopped Nathan mid-step. He turned just for a heartbeat and saw the German Shepherd pulling against the leash, paws scrabbling on the slick pavement. Lucas held firm, murmuring soft words, but Max's eyes were locked on Nathan, wild with something primal, something that screamed, "Don't leave me." Nathan raised a hand, a final wave, then forced himself through the doors. The glass slid shut behind him with a hiss, severing the thread between them. Outside, Max's whining grew louder, a mournful howl swallowed by the roar of a plane lifting into the sky. Inside Lucas's apartment that night, the storm raged on. Thunder cracked like gunfire, shaking the windows, rattling the cheap frames. Max paced, his nails clicking a frantic rhythm on the hardwood floor. His food bowl sat untouched in the kitchen, kibble scattered like forgotten promises. Lucas slumped on the couch, a beer sweating in his hand, watching the dog move from the door to the window and back again. "Come on, Max," he called, patting the cushion beside him. "Settle down, boy." But Max ignored him, ears forward, listening for a sound that wouldn't come. When Lucas tried to guide him to the bedroom, Max resisted, planting himself by the front door. He curled into a tight ball, nose pressed to the crack beneath, inhaling the faint draft from the hallway as if it might carry Nathan's scent. A soft, keening whine escaped his throat, and Lucas's chest tightened. "He'll be back," he said, kneeling to stroke Max's fur. "He'll be back before you know it." Max didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on that sliver of light, unwavering, as if his whole world hung on the hope of footsteps echoing down the hall. Days bled into weeks. Lucas turned his key in the lock each evening, and there was Max, always there, stationed by the door like a sentinel carved from stone. His ears would flick up at the sound, hope flaring in his eyes, only to dim when he saw it was Lucas. "Let's go, buddy," Lucas sighed, clipping on the leash. Max stood, obedient but listless, his tail still. Outside, the air grew heavy with the promise of rain, dark clouds clouding the sky. Max moved with purpose, nose low, sniffing every corner, every blade of grass, as if Nathan's scent might linger somewhere in the wind. Lucas watched, helpless, as the dog paused at each crossroad, lifting his head to taste the air, a soldier on a mission no one else could understand. That night, the storm broke. Lightning split the sky, a jagged white scar, and thunder roared, shaking the apartment to its bones. Lucas jolted awake, heart pounding, to a sound that turned his blood cold. Frantic scratching, desperate barking, a chaos of noise cutting through the dark. "Max!" he shouted, stumbling from bed, bare feet slapping the floor. The back door hung wide open, rain lashing through the gap, wind screaming like a banshee. "Max!" Lucas ran outside, instantly soaked, his pajamas clinging to his skin. Lightning flashed again, illuminating an empty street. Rain-slicked pavement, swaying trees, and nothing else. "Max, come back!" His voice cracked, swallowed by the storm. He searched, frantic, peering behind cars into shadows, calling until his throat burned. But Max was gone, vanished into the night like a ghost chasing a memory. Through the city, Max ran, paws pounding the flooded streets, water splashing around him. Headlights sliced through the rain, horns blaring as he darted between cars, a blur of soaked fur and blazing determination. His nose stayed low, following a scent trail nearly washed away by time and weather. A thread of Nathan, faint but unbreakable. Streets twisted into a maze, but Max knew the way. He'd walked it 100 times with Nathan, felt the rhythm of his boots beside him, heard the steady cadence of his voice. The airport loomed ahead, Terminal C glowing faintly through the downpour. Max's legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. Not until he reached those glass doors. He collapsed there, a sodden heap of fur and bone, chest heaving. The rain pounded down, relentless, but Max's eyes locked onto the entrance, sharp and unyielding. People hurried past, their footsteps a dull echo through the storm, but none were Nathan. None carried that familiar stride, that scent of leather and pine and home. Max didn't move. He couldn't. This was where Nathan had disappeared, where the world had torn them apart. And so he stayed, a soldier at his post, waiting through the dark, the cold, the endless rain. Whatever it took, he'd be here when Nathan came back, because Nathan would come back. Max knew it, deep in his marrow, with a faith that no storm could drown. The rain didn't stop. It hammered down in sheets, a relentless drumbeat against the concrete outside Terminal C, pooling around Max's trembling form. The German shepherd lay there, a sodden shadow against the glass doors, his fur plastered to his skin like a second hide. His chest heaved, each breath a shallow rasp after the night's desperate run through the storm-swept city. Lightning flickered overhead, casting jagged reflections across the wet pavement. But Max's eyes, those deep, unyielding brown eyes, stayed fixed on the entrance. The doors slid open and shut with a mechanical whoosh, spilling out travelers with their rolling suitcases and tired faces. None of them were Nathan. None carried that steady stride, that scent of leather and pine that Max could pick out in a crowd of thousands. But he didn't move. He couldn't. This was where Nathan had gone, where the world had swallowed him whole. And so Max waited, his body pressed to the cold ground, a soldier at his post. Dawn crept in slowly, painting the sky in weak shades of pink and purple. The storm had faded to a drizzle, leaving the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and jet fuel. Max's ears twitched as the airport woke up around him, footsteps clacking, voices chattering, the distant rumble of engines. A security guard in a crisp blue uniform approached, his boots splashing through puddles. "Hey, no dogs allowed here," he barked, waving his arms. Max flinched, his head dipping low, but he didn't budge. The guard stepped closer, his shadow falling over the soaked shepherd. "Get lost, mutt!" He clapped his hands, the sound sharp and echoing, but Max only backed up a few inches before settling again, his gaze locked on the doors. The guard muttered something under his breath, "Stubborn damn dog," and walked off, shaking his head. Max's tail gave a faint twitch, then stilled. He wasn't leaving. Not now, not ever. Memories flickered through his mind, sharp and vivid despite his exhaustion. Nathan's voice, low and warm, calling him Sergeant during their training days. The crunch of gravel under their boots as they marched side by side, Max's ears perked, his chest puffed out with pride. The way Nathan's hand would rest on his head after a long day, fingers scratching just right, a silent promise of, "I'm here." Those moments were Max's anchor, pulling him back to this spot, this mission. Nathan had walked through those doors. Nathan would come back through them. Max knew it, felt it in the marrow of his bones, a truth deeper than hunger or cold or the ache in his legs. So he stayed, his nose twitching as he sifted through the air, searching for that one scent that meant everything. Hours bled into days. The drizzle stopped, but the chill lingered, seeping into Max's fur. His stomach growled, a low, hollow sound, but he ignored it. Travelers hurried past, some glancing at the lone dog with curiosity, others with pity. A little girl in a pink backpack tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, look at that dog. Why is he all alone?" Her mother frowned, her eyes softening as she took in Max's matted coat and patient stare. "Maybe he's waiting for someone, sweetie," she said, ushering her daughter inside. A teenage boy tossed a half-eaten pretzel his way, but Max didn't move to take it. His focus never wavered, not even when the scent of salt and dough made his mouth water. He wasn't here for food, he was here for Nathan. Then came Sophie. She spotted him late that first evening, her orange safety vest glowing under the terminal's fluorescent lights as she finished her shift. Something about the German shepherd stopped her cold. His noble profile, the way he sat so still, so watchful, despite his bedraggled state. He didn't look like a stray, not really. Too well fed once, too purposeful now. She approached slowly, her boots soft on the concrete. "Hey there, boy," she called, crouching a few feet away, her voice gentle as a lullaby. Max's eyes flicked to her, acknowledging her presence, but slid back to the doors. Undeterred, Sophie reached into her lunch bag and pulled out a container of leftover chicken. "You look like you need this," she said, sliding it toward him. The smell hit him hard, warm, rich, tempting, but he didn't touch it. Not until Sophie's footsteps faded into the night. Only then did he lower his nose, eating quickly, his gaze darting back to the entrance every few seconds. That was the beginning. Sophie came back the next day, and the day after that, each time with a little something, kibble, water, a gentle word. Max accepted her offerings, but never her touch. He let her get close enough to see the military-style collar half hidden under his fur. But when her hand reached out, he'd shift away, polite but firm. His trust was reserved for one person, and that person wasn't here. Still, Sophie didn't give up. She started calling him Sergeant, a name that felt right the moment it left her lips. His ears twitched at it, a faint spark of recognition, and she smiled. "Yeah, that's you," she murmured. "Tough guy, huh?" The nickname spread like wildfire among the airport staff. Baggage handlers, security guards, even the coffee cart vendor who'd slip him bits of breakfast sandwiches. "Morning, Sergeant," they'd say, nodding his way. "At ease, Sergeant," the guards would joke. Max became part of the terminal's rhythm, a quiet constant amid the chaos. But the waiting wasn't easy. Nights grew colder, the wind sharper, slicing through his thinning coat. He'd curl tighter against the concrete wall, shivering as the terminal lights dimmed and the crowds thinned. His ribs began to show, faint outlines under his fur, despite the scraps he accepted. Exhaustion tugged at him, his eyes heavy, but he fought it. Every whoosh of the doors jolted him awake. Every pair of boots on the pavement made his heart leap. Was it him? Was it Nathan? Each time it wasn't, and each time the disappointment settled deeper, a weight he carried silently. Yet he never faltered. He patrolled the perimeter in the early hours, ears perked at every landing plane, then returned to his post as steady as the sunrise. One afternoon, a young woman with a pink phone case stopped to snap his picture. Max lay there, head high, watching the doors as always. She typed quickly, her thumbs flying over the screen, then walked away. Hours later, Sophie scrolled through her phone during a break and froze. There he was, Sergeant, noble and patient, staring out from her feed. The caption read, "This dog has been sitting at the airport for weeks. Who is he waiting for?" Comments flooded in. "He's so loyal. Someone take him home. What's his story?" And Sophie felt a pang in her chest. She walked over to where Max lay, kneeling beside him. "Looks like you're famous now, Sergeant," she said softly, her hand hovering over his back. He glanced at her, just for a moment, then turned back to the doors, uninterested in the world's sudden attention. Fame meant nothing. Nathan meant everything. Weeks turned to months, then years. Max's coat dulled, streaks of gray creeping in, his body thinning under the strain of endless vigilance. The airport changed around him. New faces, new uniforms, new planes. But he remained, a fixture as permanent as the glass doors themselves. The staff stopped trying to shoo him away. They built their days around him instead. A flight attendant named Jenny brought a thick blue blanket one winter, laying it near his spot. "Here you go, Sergeant," she whispered, and he settled onto it, grateful but unwavering. Sophie brought fresh water twice a shift, her quiet presence a comfort he'd grown to tolerate. Travelers took notice too, some leaving food, others snapping photos, their voices a soft hum in his ears. "Look, there's Sergeant," they'd say, pointing him out to their kids. Max barely registered them. His world had narrowed to one sound, one scent, one face. 6 years passed like a slow bleed. Max's joints stiffened, his muzzle whitened, but his eyes never lost their spark. Each morning, he'd lift his head at the first arrival, scanning the crowd with a hope that refused to die. Each night, he'd curl into his blanket, waiting for tomorrow. The terminal had become his battlefield, his vigil a war against time itself. Somewhere out there, Nathan was alive. Max felt it, a pulse in his blood, a whisper in his soul. And so he waited, through rain and snow and scorching heat. A soldier who'd never abandoned his post. The world could turn, the years could fade, but Max wouldn't. Not until Nathan walked through those doors again. Max's breath fogged in the crisp morning air, a faint white plume rising from his graying muzzle as he lay near Terminal C's glass doors. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the concrete, but his eyes, still sharp, still burning with that unshakable hope, never left the entrance. 6 years had carved their Lucas into him. The dullness of his coat, the slight tremble in his legs, the way his ribs pressed faintly against his skin. Yet he remained, a sentinel of fur and bone, watching each traveler with the same quiet intensity. The airport hummed around him, suitcases rolling, voices overlapping, planes roaring in the distance. But Max's world was smaller now, distilled to the whoosh of those doors and the ghost of a scent he'd never stopped chasing. Nathan was out there, somewhere. Max felt it, a tug deep in his chest, a thread that time couldn't sever. And so he waited, as he always had, as he always would. Half a world away, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in a sterile room, their cold glow flickering across cracked white walls. Nathan Brooks woke to the sound of his own ragged breathing, his chest tight, his skin clammy with sweat. His hands shot to his face, fingers tracing the jagged scars that ran from his temple to his jaw. Lucas of a past he couldn't fully grasp. The small mirror propped on the windowsill showed a stranger. Dark hair streaked with gray, eyes sunken and haunted. Lines etched deep around a mouth that barely remembered how to smile. 6 years. The thought hit him like a fist, twisting his gut. 6 years stolen by a fog of pain and confusion, locked away in this foreign rehabilitation center where the days bled into one another, where his own name had felt like a lie until it didn't. He was Captain Nathan Brooks again, or what was left of him. The door creaked open, and a military official stepped in, his uniform crisp, his face unreadable. "Captain Brooks," he said, holding out a folder. "You're going home." Nathan's breath caught, the word home slicing through the haze like a blade. His hands shook as he took the papers, the edges crumpling under his grip. Home. It sounded wrong, hollow after so long. What was home without his parents, who'd moved to Florida while he was dead? Without friends who'd scattered like leaves in the wind? Without Max, whose face flickered in his mind? Those brown eyes, that wagging tail, that steady presence Nathan could still feel in his bones? He'd lost so much, but Max was a wound that never closed, a piece of him he couldn't bury. The flight back to the US was a blur of engine noise and restless sleep, his scarred hands clutching the armrests as memories clawed their way up. Max nudging his palm during morning walks, the soft thud of paws on grass, the way he'd curl up at Nathan's feet every night. Fragments, sharp and fleeting, but they were all he had left. When the plane touched down, the world felt alien. Too bright, too loud, too alive. He called Lucas from a payphone outside the airport, his voice hoarse, unsteady. They met at a diner nearby, the air thick with grease and coffee. Lucas sat across from him, hands fidgeting, eyes fixed on the table. Guilt rolled off him in waves, palpable even in the silence. "There's something you need to see," Lucas said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He slid his phone across the table, his hand trembling. Nathan looked down and felt the world stop. There on the cracked screen was Max, older, thinner, his muzzle gray, but unmistakable. He sat outside Terminal C, eyes locked on the doors, a soldier still at his post. The headline above the photo screamed, "The dog at gate 12, 6 years of waiting." Nathan's vision blurred, tears burning hot as his fingers tightened around the phone. "Where is he?" he rasped, his throat raw. Lucas's voice broke. "The airport. He never left." Nathan didn't wait for more. He bolted from the booth, the chair screeching against the floor, and ran to his rental car. His heart slammed against his ribs, a wild, desperate rhythm as he turned the key, the engine roaring to life. The drive was endless, every mile a torment. Lucas sat beside him, shoulders hunched, his silence heavy with shame. "I thought he was gone," he said at last, staring at his hands. "I looked everywhere, Nathan. I didn't know." Nathan couldn't answer. His throat was too tight, his mind a storm of guilt and longing. He should have known Max wouldn't give up. That dog, his sergeant, had more faith than anyone Nathan had ever met. The memory of their last day flooded back. Max's whine cutting through the rain, those eyes pleading as Nathan walked away. He'd left him, and Max had waited anyway. 6 years. The weight of it crushed him, made his hands shake on the wheel as the airport's lights glimmered on the horizon. Back at Terminal C, Max lifted his head at the sound of a plane landing, the familiar roar vibrating through the concrete. His ears perked, his nose twitched, testing the air for that one scent he'd never forgotten. The morning crowd thickened, businessmen with briefcases, families with sleepy kids. But none were Nathan. His tail, which had started to rise, sank back down. A soft sigh escaped him, but he didn't move. Sophie approached with her usual offering, 2 bowls, water and kibble, setting them down gently. "You're really not leaving, huh?" she murmured, crouching beside him. Max's eyes met hers briefly, deep in knowing, before returning to the doors. She smiled, tracing the worn military collar with her fingers. "Tough guy," she whispered. "Sergeant." Across the ocean, Nathan had been fighting his own war. The explosion came back in flashes. Fire, screams, the world tilting as shrapnel tore through him. He'd woken in a hospital bed, tubes snaking from his arms, his mind a blank slate. Doctors spoke a language he didn't know, their faces blurring into one another. For months, he couldn't remember his own name, only fragments, the feel of fur under his hands, a tail thumping against the floor, a bark echoing in the dark. Maximum. That was the first piece that came back, the first anchor in the chaos. He'd clung to it, whispering it like a prayer as he relearned how to walk, how to speak, how to live. The military had declared him dead, lost in action, no body to bury. His family mourned, his friends moved on, but Max hadn't. Lucas's voice pulled him back to the car. "He ran that night during the storm. I couldn't stop him." Nathan's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road. "He went back to where he last saw you," Lucas continued, his words heavy. "Terminal C. He's been there ever since." Nathan's chest tightened, a sob threatening to break free. 6 years of waiting, through storms and heat and hunger, all for him. He pressed the gas harder, the car lurching forward as Terminal C came into view. The parking lot stretched out ahead, a sea of asphalt and shadows, but Nathan's focus narrowed to one thing: finding Max. Meanwhile, a journalist named Sam Harper sat in his cluttered office, coffee cooling beside his keyboard. The article stared back at him. The dog at gate 12, 6 years of waiting. He'd seen Max during a layover, watched him sit there, unwavering, and something had clicked. The story poured out: Max's military collar, his daily vigil, the airport staff who'd adopted him in their own way. Sam's finger hovered over the publish button. This wasn't just another piece. It was a heartbeat, a pulse of loyalty that deserved to be heard. He clicked it, and within hours, the internet exploded. Comments flooded in. "Who is he waiting for? This broke my heart. Someone find his owner." And the story spread, a wildfire racing across screens. Back at the airport, Max didn't know his tale had gone viral. He didn't hear the buzz of phones or the whispers of travelers snapping his picture. He only heard the doors, felt the pull of Nathan's absence. Sophie knelt beside him that evening, her shift done, watching him watch the entrance. "You're famous now, buddy," she said, her voice soft. Max didn't react. His eyes stayed locked ahead, patient, relentless. The world could clamor all it wanted. He had a mission, and it wasn't over yet. Not until Nathan walked through those doors. The rental car screeched to a halt in the Terminal C parking lot, tires skidding on the damp asphalt. Nathan Brooks didn't wait for the engine to settle. He flung the door open, boots hitting the ground hard, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. The night air bit at his skin, sharp and cold, but he barely felt it. His eyes darted across the lot, past the scattered travelers dragging suitcases, past the security guards chatting near their posts, past the flickering streetlights casting long, jagged shadows. He was searching for one thing, one shape, one soul. Maximum. 6 years stretched between them, an abyss of time and pain. But Nathan could feel him, somewhere close, pulling him like a magnet through the chaos. Lucas stumbled out after him, his breath ragged. "Nathan, wait!" But Nathan didn't hear him. He couldn't. His legs moved on instinct, carrying him toward the glass doors that loomed ahead, their reflections dancing in the dim light. His heart hammered, a wild, desperate thing threatening to burst. What if Max didn't know him? 6 years was a lifetime for a dog. Nathan was different now, scarred, graying, a ghost of the man who'd walked away that rainy afternoon. What if those brown eyes looked right through him, saw a stranger instead of a friend? The thought clawed at him, a terror sharper than any battlefield he'd faced, but he shoved it down. He had to see. He had to know. Near the entrance, Max lay curled on his worn blue blanket, his gray-flecked muzzle resting on his paws. The airport had quieted, the late-night hush broken only by the hum of cleaning machines and the occasional echo of footsteps. His body ached, joints stiff, bones weary from years of waiting, but his senses stayed sharp. tuned to every sound, every scent. His ears twitched at the crunch of boots on pavement, a rhythm different from the guard's lazy shuffle or the traveler's hurried strides. Something stirred in him, a flicker deep in his old frame. His nose lifted, testing the air, and caught it, a faint thread, achingly familiar. Leather, pine, home. His eyes snapped open, cloudy but alert, searching the darkness. Nathan stopped dead, 10 feet away, his breath hitching. There he was, Maximum. Thinner, older, his once glossy coat dulled by time, but unmistakable. The German shepherd's head lifted slowly, ears standing tall, nose working frantically. Their gazes locked across the terminal floor. Brown meeting brown, a silent collision that stopped time. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Nathan's voice broke free, rough and trembling. "Max?" It was a whisper, a plea, a prayer. Max froze. His body went rigid, every muscle taut. That voice, it cut through 6 years of silence, a sound he'd held on to in the deepest corners of his soul. His ears strained forward, his nose twitched, confirming what his heart already knew. Nathan. It was Nathan. Something ignited inside him, a surge of life flooding his tired bones. He sprang up, arthritic joints be damned, and launched forward. His bark erupted, hoarse and raw, a cry of joy and disbelief that echoed off the terminal walls. He hit Nathan like a freight train, paws slamming into his chest, sending him crashing backward onto the concrete. Nathan laughed, a broken, tear-soaked sound, as he wrapped his arms around Max's neck. The dog's weight pinned him down, a frantic blur of fur and wagging tail. Max pawed at him, whimpering, licking his face with desperate, sloppy kisses. "You waited," Nathan choked out, burying his face in Max's fur. It smelled of rain and dust and time, but beneath it, there was still that hint of home. "You really waited." Tears streamed down his cheeks, hot and unstoppable, mingling with Max's damp coat. He pressed his forehead to the dog's, feeling the warmth, the life, the love that had never wavered. Around them, the airport stilled. Travelers paused, luggage forgotten, watching the reunion unfold. Sophie stood nearby, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaking her cheeks. She'd known this moment would come. Somehow, she'd always known. Lucas lingered a few steps back, his shoulders shaking as he drew in a shaky breath. Max kept going, paws pressing against Nathan's chest, tail whipping back and forth like a metronome gone wild. He had to make sure, had to feel Nathan, smell him, hear him. 6 years of waiting exploded in that instant, a dam breaking, flooding them both with raw, unshakable joy. Nathan sat up, still holding Max close, his hands running over the dog's frame. Thinner, frailer, but alive. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have been here." Max didn't care about apologies. He pressed closer, a low whine rumbling in his throat, as if saying, "You're here now." The terminal lights cast a soft glow over them, framing the scene like a painting. Man and dog, reunited against all odds. Sophie stepped forward, wiping her eyes. "Hey, Sergeant," she said softly, her voice thick. "You found him." Hours later, Nathan's old apartment glowed with the warm light of a single lamp. The furniture was worn, the air heavy with dust, but it felt alive again. Max lay sprawled on the floor between Nathan and Lucas, his chest rising and falling in deep, peaceful breaths. For the first time in 6 years, he slept without stirring, without one eye cracked open for the door. Nathan couldn't stop watching him. His fingers moved through Max's fur, tracing the gray around his muzzle, the slight hollows where muscle had faded. "I thought I'd lost you," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. Lucas shifted in his chair, the leather creaking. "We all thought you were gone, Nathan," he said, his own voice breaking. "The reports, they were so sure." Silence settled over them, heavy but not empty. The clock ticked past midnight, its steady rhythm a counterpoint to Max's soft snores. Nathan's hand never left the dog's fur, grounding him in the moment. "Tell me," he said quietly, glancing at Lucas. "Everything." When he ran, what happened at the airport? Lucas leaned forward, rubbing his face. That night, the storm, he just bolted, straight back to Terminal C. Nothing I did could stop him. He paused, swallowing hard. He waded through everything: rain, snow, heat. The staff looked after him, called him Sergeant, but he never really let anyone in. He was waiting for you. Nathan's eyes stung, fresh tears threatening to spill. 6 years, he whispered, more to himself than Lucas. He never gave up. Lucas nodded, his gaze fixed on Max's sleeping form. Neither did you, in a way. You came back. They sat there, two men bound by a dog's faith, piecing together the lost years. Nathan spoke of the explosion, the fire, the shrapnel, the darkness that swallowed his mind, the rehab center where he'd fought to remember, clinging to Max's image like a lifeline. Lucas told of the searches, the guilt, the airport community that had rallied around Max. The night stretched on, their voices low, their words weaving a bridge across the gap. When morning light slipped through the blinds, Nathan stirred from a light doze on the couch. A soft whine pulled him awake, followed by the nudge of a cold nose against his palm. He opened his eyes to Max, tail wagging slowly, brown eyes shining with that same devotion. "Hey, buddy," Nathan rasped, scratching behind his ears. Max's tail thumped faster, a quiet joy in the motion. Nathan stood, and Max rose too, stiff but steady, following him without a glance at the door. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't need to wait. They were home. The morning sun spilled through Nathan's apartment window, painting the wooden floor in soft gold. Max lay stretched out beside the couch, his gray-flecked muzzle resting on his paws, chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. Nathan sat nearby, a steaming coffee mug cradled in his scarred hands, watching his faithful companion with a quiet ache in his chest. The German shepherd's fur was thinner now, his frame fragile from years of waiting, but those brown eyes still glowed with contentment. No trace of the anxious vigil that had defined him for so long. For the first time in 6 years, Max didn't stir at the sound of footsteps or crane his neck toward the door. He was home, truly home, and Nathan felt the weight of that truth settle over him like a warm blanket. Their days found a gentle rhythm. Each morning began with Max's nudge, a cold nose against Nathan's hand, a soft whine of greeting, followed by slow walks in the park. Max moved with a limp now, his joints stiff from age and exposure, but his tail wagged at every rustling leaf, every squirrel darting past. Nathan walked beside him, patient and unhurried, his hand resting on Max's back as they paused to bask in the sunlight. Afternoons claimed the porch as their sanctuary, Nathan with a book, Max sprawled in a patch of warmth, his breathing a steady counterpoint to the turning pages. Neighbors waved as they passed, and Max's tail thumped in quiet acknowledgement. Night brought peace. Max curled on his bed near Nathan's, sleeping deeply, no longer pacing or whining at shadows. The bond between them, forged in separation and tempered by reunion, filled the silence with something sacred. One crisp morning, Nathan drove them back to Terminal C. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos, but Max sat calmly in the passenger seat, head tilted as the familiar glass doors came into view. Sophie waited outside, her orange vest bright against the gray concrete, her face lighting up when she saw them. Nathan helped Max down, supporting his frail frame as his paws touched the ground he'd guarded for so long. Sophie knelt beside him, tears brimming as she scratched his head. "Hey, Sergeant," she whispered, her voice thick. "You made it home." Max's tail wagged slowly, a faint echo of the wild energy he'd once had. Nathan smiled, his chest tight. "I wanted to thank you," he said to Sophie, "for looking after him all those years." She stood, brushing off her knees. "He never left, you know. 6 years right there by those doors." Travelers paused to watch, some recognizing Max, others drawn by the quiet scene. A flight attendant who'd once brought him treats knelt to say goodbye, her eyes wet. A security guard nodded respectfully from afar. Nathan guided Max to his old spot, where the blanket had long since been replaced by memory. The dog settled with a sigh, his gaze sweeping the terminal one last time, The sounds of planes, the chatter of crowds, it all faded into the background. His tail gave a gentle wag, and then he turned to Nathan, following him back to the truck without a backward glance. That chapter was closed. They'd written a new one together. But time moved on, relentless as ever. One morning, Nathan noticed Max didn't rise at the sound of kibble hitting his bowl. He stayed in his bed, eyes open but hesitant, his tail giving only a weak thump. "Max?" Nathan called, crossing the room to kneel beside him. The dog tried to stand, legs trembling, breath shallow and labored. Nathan's heart clenched at the soft whimper that escaped him. "It's okay, buddy. I've got you." He slid his arms under Max, lifting him gently, and drove to the vet, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on Max's back. Dr. Sarah Martinez examined him with care, her hands gentle as she felt his joints, listened to his heart. "He's tired," she said finally, meeting Nathan's worried gaze. "The years at the airport, they took a lot out of him, but he held on for you. That's rare." Nathan stood by the table, fingers buried in Max's fur. "I just want him happy," he said, voice breaking. The drive home was quiet, Max's head resting on the seat, eyes fixed on Nathan with unwavering trust. "Whatever time we have left," Nathan whispered, "we'll make it count." And they did. Days passed in tender stillness, Max on the porch, soaking up the sun, Nathan beside him, talking softly about nothing and everything. The dog's breaths grew slower, his body heavier against Nathan's leg, but his tail still wagged at the sound of his voice. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they sat together on the porch. Max's head rested on Nathan's knee, eyes half closed, peaceful. Nathan ran his fingers through the soft, silvered fur, feeling the weight of their lost years. "I should have come home sooner," he murmured, tears gathering. Max sighed, pressing closer, as if to say, "It's enough." The crickets sang, the breeze carried the scent of jasmine, and in that quiet, Max's chest stilled. His final breath slipped away, a gentle release, with Nathan's hand on his head, his best friend beside him. Nathan stayed there holding him until the stars blinked awake overhead, witnesses to a bond that time couldn't break. A week later, the silence was deafening. Nathan moved through the house like a shadow, the absence of Max's pause, his whines, his warmth cutting deeper each day. The coffee maker hummed, but no tail thumped in response. The porch felt empty, the blanket crumpled where Max had last lain. Then Sophie called. "Come to the airport," she said, her voice warm but urgent. Nathan drove alone, the cab silent without Max's panting, his heart heavy but curious. A small crowd gathered near Terminal C, their murmurs soft, reverent. Sophie met him at the entrance, tears in her eyes, and led him to the wall. There, gleaming in the sunlight, was a bronze plaque. Max's image stood proud, ears perked, gaze steady, a soldier forever. Below it, etched deep, for 6 years he waited. Love never forgets. Nathan's hand trembled as he touched the metal, tracing Max's face. "He'd hate this fuss," he chuckled, voice thick. Sophie smiled through her tears. "Maybe, but he deserves it." People stopped to look, some snapping photos, others reading in silence, a testament to a loyalty that touched them all. Nathan pulled Max's old collar from his pocket, the leather worn smooth, and draped it over the plaque. It hung there, a piece of their story, a quiet farewell. Driving home, Nathan rolled down the window, the breeze ruffling his hair. He smiled faintly, hearing, or imagining, the jingle of Max's tags in the wind, an echo of love carried forever. Weeks later, in the park, he paused at an adoption event. A mixed-breed dog with patchy fur and patient eyes met his gaze, her tail wagging slow and steady. "She's been waiting a while," a volunteer said. Nathan knelt, offering his hand, and she licked it, cautious but warm. "Okay," he said, voice steady. "Let's go home." As they walked away, he glanced at the sky, feeling Max watching, a presence beyond time. Was this new companion waiting for someone too? The question lingered, soft and unanswered, a whisper of mystery in the autumn air. The tale of Nathan and Max isn't just a journey of unwavering loyalty across time. It's a testament to a love that never fades, even when all hope seems lost. From Max's steadfast vigil at Terminal C to his peaceful passing beside Nathan under the sunset, and the bronze plaque that immortalizes a dog who never gave up, their story leaves us with a profound echo of sacrifice and connection. But this isn't the end. If Max's devotion touched your heart and you crave more stories that stir the soul, hit that subscribe button on our YouTube channel right now. Every week we bring you new journeys, new emotions. Don't miss out, because every story deserves to be heard.